Hi, everybody. Welcome to the first session of the day. My name is Angelica Hofstad, and I'm with One Young World. I want to welcome everybody here in our audience in Glasgow, as well as everybody who's attending digitally back home. Behind me, you'll find the Slido code, so please feel free to drop in any questions you may have during the session so that we can address them at the end. It is my absolute pleasure to welcome the first session of today on moving forward, constructing sustainable transport systems for future generations. So without further ado, join me in welcoming to the stage Mete Koban, Sophie Howe, and Shanona Mitra.
Morning, everyone. Morning, everyone. Morning. Great. Thank you for the welcome. Thank you so much for your very kind introduction. Just before we quickly kick off, I wanted to introduce myself. My name is Mete Koban. I have got a few different hats on. So I am a councillor in the London Borough of Hackney, also the cabinet member for energy, waste, transport and public realm, overseeing our response to the climate crisis. And then, of course, I also lead an organisation called My Life, My Say, which is all about trying to encourage more young people to participate in democracy. So we're here to talk about moving forward, constructing sustainable transport systems for future generations. And I guess, you know, what we have seen over the past 2 years, especially during the pandemic, is, you know, we've seen a different way of people moving around, you know, to go to work. Most people have been working from home, of course. We've seen air quality drastically improve as a result of, you know, people working from home and driving less cars and taking flights to conferences or to various work trips. So I'm really looking forward to having this conversation today because, you know, if we are truly to tackle the climate crisis, we're going to have to take drastic action on trying to shift and innovate around our transport systems and reimagine the way in which human beings move around to work, travel, and obviously live their lives. I'm very, very pleased to be joined by a fantastic two speakers. To my left, we've got Sophie Howe, who is the first Future Generations Commissioner in Wales, which is a transformative role, and I wish that other places around the world or across the UK actually followed suit. And I'm sure you will tell us about why it's important, particularly in terms of engaging young people's voices. And then we've also got Shanona as well to my furthest left, who is a student at King's College London, who's originally from Wales, and I know that does a lot of activism around sort of getting young people engaged more around climate, but also more importantly around amplifying their voices. So I guess I wanted to kick off with you, Sophie. I mean, we talk a lot about, you know, I spoke a little bit about why it's so important that we reduce transport emissions, because we know that I think it accounts for 24% of total emissions of CO2 emissions across the globe. What role do you see young people play in helping reimagine the way in which we move around as a society?
Well, I think young people are experiencing transport in a completely different way. In fact, well, the World Economic Forum sort of suggests that young people born today will never own a car. And for my generation, you know, I count myself, hopefully not too much any longer, but certainly count my kind of former self and my former, you know, young people as part of the problem, because when I was 17, the first thing you wanted to do was to pass your driving test, get a car, and, you know, be able to be sort of mobile in that way, and that was like a real priority. I've got 3 teenage sons. Well, one's 22, not a teenager anymore, and one's just passed his test, but the others, they're not bothered about learning to drive. They don't want the hassle of a car. They want to be able to use public transport. Cycling to school, walking to school is their complete norm. So I think that, you know, as with many things, the fact that, you know, young people are digital natives, and people like me and, you know, even older generations who are the predominant makeup of current decision makers, they live completely different worlds. So I think that there's something really kind of important around understanding the actual lived experiences of young people, because what we tend to do when we're taking decisions on things, you take decisions on the basis of your experiences. You might try not to, but that is what happens. And that's why young people's voice is so critically important, because their experiences are completely different. The world they will lead, the lives they will lead, the lives they want to lead will be completely different. And so we can't be just taking decisions with one perspective in mind.
Yeah, absolutely. And Shaloni, if I may come to you, just sort of picking up on sort of Sophie's comments, what do you see, you know, in terms of, you know, young people's attitudes and behaviors in terms of the way they move around? You know, we come from a very car-dependent, you know, nation, as Sophie very eloquently sort of described. Do you see that changing within the young generation? I mean, how do you sort of see that in conversation with your peers?
Yeah, so I firstly wanted to say that I represent today the Youth Climate Ambassadors for Wales. So we're like a group of 15, 13 to 25-year-olds all over Wales. And I think it's really interesting what you said actually about how your sons feel less car dependent, because I think for us and a lot of our group, it very much varies from where you're from. So in the cities, so I currently, as you said, study in London. Right now, I have absolutely no need for a car. The public transport is amazing, it's accessible, it's really easy to take. But where I'm from in North Wales, I couldn't move around without a car. And in that way, it's really interesting that even within Wales, within the same age group, things vary. So that's really interesting. And with what you said, how do young people, you know, how's it going to change? I think it's definitely shifting. I think my generation, especially within our group, are aware of the impacts of, you know, public transport, climate change, all of that. So, you know, I can't speak for other generations, but for us, I do think we actively try and take public transport. You know, we're aware of the decisions we make probably more than people think we are. But again, it's about making it accessible. So I've seen throughout COP26, throughout my time at the group, that young people can influence decisions, and like you said, we should be. So I think it's about making the better choice, which we know is public transport, more accessible, because for a lot of my friends back home, for a lot of people who are in rural areas, it's not possible. So I think picking up from what you said, it's really important to speak to a variety of young voices. Because we all have different experiences, but it's, you know, they're all equally as valid.
Yeah, and I'm so glad that you picked up on the point about the sort of the urban-rural divide, because, you know, too often we can get very sort of, you know, people like me who are brought up in London, you know, there's lots of public transport available, and I think it's easier for us to say, hey, why are you driving, for example? Why don't you just take the public transport? This is quite a contentious sort of subject in many ways, and I know that from my own personal role. In London, for example, we're carrying out a number of schemes, including low traffic neighbourhood schemes, which, you know, is very divisive in many ways, in the sense that, you know, it's almost like you're telling people the way that they should travel, right? So how do you find that balance? And it's a question for both of you. And I promise you, I'm not asking because I'm trying to find the answer for myself, but how do you find that balance between doing the right thing to tackle the climate crisis and to reduce transport emissions, but at the same time, almost like you're not telling people how they should live their life, especially when they're living their life in a very difficult time. Particularly, I'm thinking about more working class people who need to go about and do their day-to-day job. Sophie, if I come to you.
Yeah, I think it is a really tricky one, and it's always contentious. There are some like live issues in Wales at the moment. In the capital city, one of the main sort of thoroughfares through the city was closed to anything other than buses and taxis. There was a big sort of backlash there, and they've actually had to reopen one of the lanes. The reason for that, actually, and this is where it gets really tricky, because how do you change the system that we're in before you've kind of created the new system that you want to get to? So, and you kind of got to do that. There's got to be some kind of tough decisions. What actually happened there is that by closing that road, you were then knocking the kind of air pollution levels off into the other residential streets. So there's a kind of, they've made a balance there of reopening just one lane, whilst then trying to look at other solutions like congestion charging, which would then enable that investment to go into public transport and so on. There are some other like really brave decisions, and I think sometimes you need to look at things holistically, because when we talk about, transport, there's a problem with congestion. And I spent some time in Texas a couple of years ago, and I don't know if anyone's ever been there, but I think I was on like a 9-lane motorway at one point, which I think had probably started off at a 3-lane motorway, and it got more congested, and they just kept adding more and more and more lanes. So someone said this analogy to me, which I think is absolutely right. You don't deal with obesity by loosening your belt. You don't deal with traffic congestion by building more roads, because basically we build a road, and we'll fill it. And that, again, was a kind of really live issue in Wales. Plans to spend the entire of the Welsh Government borrowing capacity on building a 13-mile stretch of motorway. Now, this is where the Wellbeing of Future Generations Act comes in, and just a little, if you allow me, just a little snippet on what that does. Requires all our decision makers to demonstrate how they're meeting today's needs without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their needs. Sets out 7 long-term interconnected wellbeing goals for Wales. So things like a more prosperous Wales, which is about a low-carbon society, ecological resilience, a more equal Wales, a healthier Wales. And when you start looking at a problem of how do we deal with congestion, how do we solve that in a way which is going to maximize the benefits across all of those goals, you get a kind of completely different response. Because we've tended to say, we've got a problem with congestion, we need to build another road, or we need to expand a road. Actually, what we need to do is to find a solution that is going to meet our carbon emissions targets, ensure ecological resilience, improve the health of our nation, and address socioeconomic disadvantage. In that case, 25% of the lowest income families in the region didn't own a car. So we're spending all of that money on those who were already comparatively better off. We've got an obesity crisis, we've got a public health crisis across a range of different things, including air pollution. So actually what we need to do is to get people out of their cars. We need them walking, cycling to the bus stop. We need a range of integrated transport approaches, rather than having them all sit in their cars in congestion. Obviously, our carbon emissions targets and the proposals for this particular road was going to go through a nature reserve, which was an added issue. So when you start looking sort of differently at it and saying, what are we going to do, which is going to meet all of those goals? We're going to spend £1.5 billion on a road. Now what we're going to do is spend £800 million investing in active travel, 6 new train station links, and so on. And that, in the long term, will help to transform.
There's so much that I want to... There's so much that I want to unpack into that, and I wish we can bring you to London, because I think lots of people need to hear from you in London. By the way, if you see me looking through my phone, it's not because I'm text messaging or doing other things. This is like me trying to keep up with the Gen Z way of moderating a panel. So just FYI. Okay, someone's voted for Sophie's policies. Great. So then I want to come to you, because we're obviously at COP26 right now, and loads of world leaders are coming together to discuss ways in which we can reduce emissions across a wide range of different areas. And of course, today is Transport Day, which is why we're having this panel today. What is it that we need to, what are you looking for from world leaders to essentially, what does good look like? What does success look like out of this? And I guess, the danger with these conversations at COP26 is it happens at a very sort of much an national level. How do you sort of visualize that at a local level? So what does success look like for you out of this COP, in terms of what do you want to see from leaders? And 2 is, how do we sort of get this international message out to local communities?
That's a very big question. I think it's similar to what I wanted to answer to the question before, is that I think when you're making these big decisions, obviously a lot of decision makers we know come from similar backgrounds. I think it's actually about integrating with the community. So in terms of public transport especially, if you're not educating the community on it, if they're not reaping the benefits, seeing it themselves, if it's not accessible, then you can put in as many things as you want, but people aren't going to want to use it. So I think that in terms of how do we do it, that's one of the biggest things. You need to actually work with people, not force things on them, not tell them what to do, like you were saying. And I think that comes from actually going down to grassroots, going to communities, asking them what they want, actually letting them see how things are happening, taking it to schools, taking it to workplaces. So I think that's a big issue that decision makers are having, because, you know, even before I got into climate activism, things were happening and I would be like, what is this? Why is it happening? How is it going to help me? So I think that's important. In terms of at COP26, what do I want to get out of it? I think what most young people want now is action. You know, there's been a lot of talking, a lot of promises. We want to see things happening. We want to see, especially from my group and my own personal perspective, I want to see underrepresented groups represented. So that includes Youth Voice, the Global South, Indigenous peoples. I want decision makers to, you know, kind of step out of their little bubble and go down and, you know, speak to people who are really affected by climate change or any social issues for that fact. So yeah, I think that's what I want to see them, you know, actually look and listen to what's happening, actively listen, and then form actions from that. And they do need to be, you know, quick. They can't be long term. They can't be, you know, 2070 actions, because by that time things will have changed. So I think that's definitely what we want to see.
Yeah, for sure. And I guess just sort of coming back to your point, Sophie, and sort of to the conversation. I mean, obviously this is really important because we want to reduce our carbon footprint. But part of it is also about trying to reimagine what the future of our neighborhoods could look like, right? It's not just about, you know, okay, we're doing this because we have to save the planet. Yes, of course, that's important. But it's also about when you're walking on your street, for example, you're not just rushing to go home because it's just really bad air quality. You want to actually enjoy that trip. Yeah. So if we look outside, well, we can't look outside right now because we're in a venue. But if we imagine sort of Glasgow in front of us right now, what does like the future of transport look like, or what should it look like? You spoke about active travel, but how would you like to see a future, you know, a future, or you know, where you're from in Wales? How would you like to see it sort of play out?
I mean, I want to see an integrated transport system, and I think picking up on the point on, you know, rural communities as well. I think, you know, we're never going to be in a position where, you know, everyone can take every journey that they need to go on by bike or by public transport. What we can get to is a system where you can take the biggest bulk of your journey in that way. And I think that's the sort of position that we need to be in. But I think there are also sometimes the kind of less obvious solutions are actually the best ones. So in Wales, we've got a continued target for 30% of people working from home. That is obviously then reducing the need to travel. I've got a young woman who works for me. She started as an apprentice. She's living at home with her parents. We always had, you know, anytime, anywhere working anyway in my team. But actually, you know, there's still this sort of cultural thing, I've got to come into the office. And COVID has broken that down. And, you know, certainly in Wales, we want that to kind of continue, that it's okay to work from wherever. She's actually saved enough money through not travelling to be able to get a deposit to move out of home. Now that is transformational for her life. I also think that, you know, that kind of sense of, okay, there's some real issues for our city centres and empty buildings and all of those sorts of things with people, you know, they're not getting the commuter trade. But what's the knock-on consequence of that to our local communities? Does that mean instead of buying our lunch in Pret, we're going to be buying our lunch in the local independent baguette shop or supporting the local independent traders? And that has a really positive knock-on consequence as well. Again, policies, you know, back when I first started work and I had a young child, it was back in kind of 2003 or thereabouts, the daily commute was a nightmare. It could only be done by car because I had to get to a childminder's, one to a childminder, one to school. I'd have to get in my car, I'd have to be in work by 9 o'clock. It was all a big stress. Now, well, certainly pre-pandemic, when I'm getting the bus to work, I get on the bus at 9:15, just down the road from school, and about 70% of the people on that bus are parents from the school who've just dropped their kids off. That's because flexible working has become mainstream and has become the norm. Now, you wouldn't think, let's have flexible working so we can reform the way people travel, but that's actually the knock-on consequence. And so your point around walking in the shoes of the people that we're trying to develop policy for, what sorts of things are going to affect their behaviour, that's why that's so important, because sometimes it's the less obvious solution which is the best one, if you understand lives.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And Shalona, just to come to you, I think one of the things that have really surprised me out of this conference is like there's this assumption that you just basically replace all petrol cars with EVs. So let's just ramp up EVs and then everything's going to be okay. Whereas actually we know that electric vehicles also pollute in different ways, for example, through the tire pollution, tire wear. But also, you know, when you think about our roads, I think in terms of cars, obviously the space it takes up on the roads is also disproportionate in comparison to cyclists, to people who walk or take public transport. So do you think electric vehicles are the way forward? Is question one. And two is, do you think, we're now in day 10 of COP26, do you think that from what you've heard so far, decision makers have an understanding of what needs to happen to move forward, or are you not there?
Okay, so I won't say that my knowledge on electric vehicles is great,
Yeah.
but I will try to answer it. So I definitely think that I agree with your point. Just, you know, exchanging every diesel or petrol car with an electric vehicle is not the solution. It might help in the short term. It's definitely better, but it's not the solution. I think, like we've been saying, making public transport the most accessible option should be what we're looking to do, whether that be, you know, I think there are different steps that different communities need to take. Cities might be able to transform into electric public transport. Like obviously the COP buses are electric. Where I'm from in North Wales, we don't even have a normal public transport system, so it would be great to even get that up and running. So I think that would be my perception, is that we need to get public transport up and running first. So whether that, I think that means, you know, making it like frequent. So for example, when I tried to take the bus into town, if I missed one, I couldn't get one for another 3 hours, which isn't, you know, that doesn't help. So I think that would, you know, making that option most accessible. So whether that be buses more frequently, making them cheaper, you know, getting the train home from university is extremely expensive. And almost to the point where it makes more sense for my family to come drive down and pick me back up and take me. So, you know, that needs to be, you were saying before about working class people, people who are in disadvantaged situations. It needs to be accessible for them. You know, electric vehicles are not what they're looking for. So public transport needs to be accessible. And then in terms of, am I hopeful about what's coming out of COP26? It's a difficult question. I think in terms of whether decision makers and world leaders are getting it, is tricky, because I think our group has touched on this in multiple interviews. If world leaders don't represent what communities represent, then they can't get it. So, you know, if there aren't women in power, if there aren't young people talking, if there aren't indigenous people, if there aren't people from the global south, they simply can't, because we all have different views, we all have different, you know, backgrounds. So there needs to be real conversations being had. I would like to say that I am still hopeful. You know, we've seen things happening. There's been the deforestation agreement has happened. So I wouldn't say that I'm ecstatic about the actions that have been taken, but I would say we still have a few days left, and I am hopeful.
Yeah, and the thing is as well, I think like there's this, it's weird because of like COP, this big moment happening, and there's this weird almost expectation that that's it, you know, we do everything at COP and then the conversation stops. Yeah. It's like it doesn't stop at COP. We still continue to have these conversations, and like, you know, yes, of course we need to be absolutely ambitious during COP to get the most that we can, especially when you think about from a local government perspective. You know, we need the powers, both regulatory but also financial powers, to be able to implement a lot of these changes that we're talking about. But also, like, you know, I'm really concerned that, you know, everyone is almost just going to feel like, oh, it didn't happen at COP, and then we just lose that momentum of the campaigning and the sort of the advocacy that's happening. So I think it's really important that COP is a big moment, but it's not sort of like, well, that's it, COP happens or not, and then nothing else happens after. Conscious of time, I know we've got lots of people who are watching us online who have been submitting questions via Slido, and I know we've got colleagues here from One Young World who are going to help us receive some of those questions. I wonder before, if I go to the online, is there anyone who has a question in the room? So we've got a gentleman right there. If you could just say your name and your question, please.
Yeah, hi, it's Stefan. We talked about, like, for our cities, they're going to be changing, we're going to clean up our act, they're going to be, but isn't that going to increase gentrification? And what policies can we implement in order to avoid that?
Very good question, and I think it speaks to before the class issue that we had. Should we take another question, 2 questions, and then we'll take them in rounds of 3? So we got the lady at the front and then gentleman there.
My name's Valerie Wood-Gager. I think we're going to meet properly, aren't we? I'm speaking on Friday at the Commissioner's invitation. One quick thing about electric cars that a lot of people haven't thought of, and that is the batteries. When the batteries are no longer able to be recharged, they are going to go into landfill, and that's going to be a very bad news. So my question really to the board is, would you like to come and plant a tree for Granny? I started this project, which is why I've been invited to come and talk on Friday. I couldn't have a big party for my 80th birthday, and a guy in Malawi said, we'll have a planting day for you, Grandma. And I thought, and I floated it around the world, and it has gone round the world. I won't say it's gone viral, but it has gone round the world. We've got trees from Finland to Peru.
Yeah.
And we're creating an e-book. You were talking about, sorry, I will be quick.
Yeah.
We were talking about telling governments the e-book will go to every government in the world when it's got more content.
Yeah.
And it will say, these are your voters, get your finger out. Or words to that effect.
Great, we'll be there.
Thank you.
And then we've got one question here as well.
Question is,
Sorry, yeah.
take my mask down. The question is, for about 80 years, we've told people that a measure of success is to own their own car. How do we change that perception so that we kind of change what the measure of success is for young people so that they're not aiming for their own car ownership?
Yeah, right. Really good questions and an invite. So I think just to go back to the first question, I slightly touched on this at the start when I was talking about this issue, this conflict between sort of, wanting to do the right thing for our planet and to reduce emissions, but then how that's perceived within communities, and then also the implications of that and how it plays out in terms of the demographics. So, Sophie, it would be great if you can touch on that question. And then question 2, Shanona, is how do we, well, I think you slightly touched upon what young people feel, but how do we sort of change that narrative now that we've been, for the last 10, 15, 20 years, we've been pushing forward with like car ownership or, more sort of eco-friendly ways of living, whereas now we just have to now realise that there's a different way to move forward. So Sophie, if I start with you first.
I think, to the point on you try and do something for a good purpose, and that leads to a negative knock-on consequence, so say gentrification. I think that's where this requirement around the way we take decisions is so important. So one, to look to the long term, because half the time we take decisions based on a current problem and we haven't even considered potential future trends or scenarios, and then we take decisions in a way which is only looking at trying to narrowly solve the problem that we've got in front of us. The issue around Macron's proposals around giving grants to people for electric vehicles and and increasing fuel duty and so on is a really good example of that, because that's great if you can afford sort of £35,000 or euros rather than £38,000 to buy an electric vehicle. But actually, if you couldn't afford to buy a car, or you're on really low income, that's really not going to help you. So that's an example of, yes, if you're just looking to decarbonise the transportation system, EVs could be the answer. The problem is that actually issues are much wider than that. We need to decarbonise our transport whilst addressing socio-economic and other forms of inequality, whilst improving health, whilst improving communities, and so on. So that governance infrastructure is really important. Just on the kind of measures of sort of success, if you like, I think that younger people are, they perceive things in a different way. you're much better to answer this than me, but it used to be the case that the most important thing when you entered the world of work was the salary and your progression through a company. Now what we know is that actually it's life-work balance that people are looking for. It's, they're a completely different set of values. They want to work for companies who support their values and so on. And so I think that we're moving in that direction in terms of ownership of a whole range of things, cars just being one of them as well. And I think that means that there's a lot of hope for a different model of thinking and doing in the future.
Yeah, and just to sort of pick up on the first question around sort of this issue around class and obviously how you benefit people. One of the things that I've been quite clear sort of in Hackney in my role as a sort of cabinet lead for this, it's about how I think the problem with this whole debate right now around shifting to a greener economy, there's a really important aspect around just transition and loads of other things which I don't want to sort of go into because it opens up a whole other wide range of conversation. But really it's about understanding how you create that sort of like that green dividend for people, right? So how do you make sure, so for example, shifting to a cleaner transport system, what does that mean for working class people? It means better air quality so that they don't have to suffer with asthma or sort of the associated health risks that come with it. When we talk about green jobs, for example, one, what do those green jobs look like in the community? And one of the things that I've been quite clear in my borough is about making sure that, one, we're able to quantify and understand what that looks like locally. But two, is there's a real opportunity where I think a lot of people can benefit from the shift towards a greener economy in terms of sustainability and the pay that comes with it as well. And I think we need to make sure that we improve that climate literacy within those communities so that they benefit from that. So it's not like, there's this transformation and revolution that happens and then they cap onto it 15 years later and it's like, well, I didn't really benefit from the system. So I think there's something around educating and working together to raise awareness around these issues. And then more broadly as well, when you think about your energy bills, for example, from shifting to a greener world, your energy bills are going to reduce as well. So actually, I think, shifting, tackling the climate crisis goes hand in hand with social justice, and I think we need to do better at articulating that. I think the problem is it's sort of seen as a very much, at the moment, it's seen as a very much sort of a middle class issue where people have time on their hands to talk about. And for many working class people, it's sort of like, well, I need to go about my day-to-day job. Why are you telling me I can't drive? Or why are you telling me that I need to, invest £35,000 on an EV car or replace my gas boiler, which I don't have money for? I think those are the conversations that we need to be much more upfront about. So that was to throw my 2 pence in. Shannon, come back to you on the question around sort of perception. How do we do that?
I wanted to touch first on, it's really interesting that you said that the youth perspective is shifting. I definitely think it is in some cases, but I still think it's there, the previous mindset, especially like you said for, lower class people, people who are struggling to even find jobs. So I think still in my school, in my community, a lot of what we were taught is, find a job, get a car. We're still taught it. So I actually think that something that's often, not touched upon when we talk about youth empowerment is that it should come, or that part of it should come from the top down. It shouldn't have to be young people's, responsibility to change their mindset, because we're still learning. We've got, a lot of things to deal with. Obviously, adults do too. But, I shouldn't have to worry about what I'm going to, have to deal with in 20 years' time. Mm-hmm. So I do think in that, in that sense, it does need to come from decision makers. It should be taught in schools. It should be taught in the community that there are different options for us, that we don't have to get a car, that we don't have to get a certain job. And like you touched upon just then, I've learned this throughout my time at COP, that it's extremely important to not talk about climate change as its own thing, because it affects every aspect of life. But it's difficult to see that, especially if you're not, within this, conversation, especially if you're not talked, if you don't feel a part of it, because let's be honest, decision makers don't talk to, a lot of different communities. So I think in that sense, the youth perspective is changing, but it's, from my perspective at least, it's really difficult to be a part of this movement, because we do have to push to be heard. we have to go out of our way to be heard, and it should really be that we don't have to do that. So I think that would be my opinion, that the mindset does need to be changed, but it needs to be changed by everyone, and in that way young people will follow on.
Yeah, no, I couldn't agree anymore. And I think, you're absolutely right. Climate change and climate justice is hand in hand with the social justice element. Because again, like I know people, for example, like from my background, I'm brought up on a council estate. And, most people from my background wouldn't have disposable levels of income where they could just put on a new property, for example. So for them, like, the idea of owning a car is a sense of, look, I've done well in life. This is my social status. I've worked hard, done well, got a nice car, because I can't afford to spend 200 grand or 300 grand on a new property. So I think it's about trying to tackle that narrative. But I think it needs to go back to those conversations that need to happen in and among communities, but also, of course, within schools as well. Conscious of time, and I want to engage our online audience if we've got questions. So if I may have the microphone. Yeah.
Hello, yes, we're having some brilliant interactions with our digital audience. And following on from the next generation, Kasia from Poland has asked, the maintenance of new infrastructure will be on the next generation. How can we ensure this is made responsibly?
Okay, so what we're gonna do now is we're gonna go very snappy with our answers, so we can go through as many questions as we want, because we've got 9 minutes and 30 seconds. So, Sophie, do you want to go quickly with that one?
Yeah, I think it's about taking a long-term approach and accounting for those things, isn't it? Which, again, I keep coming back to the way that our systems of governance work. If we have mandatory requirements, you have to think about this in the long term, not just the short term, then those problems get a lot easier to solve.
Did you want to say anything, or should we move to the next question?
Yeah, I just wanted to say I think it's also about follow-through. You can put in a policy, you can put in an action, but if you don't follow through with the community, if you don't check that it's working, then you're not going to have a long-term solution.
Yeah. Right, next question. Do you know what this feels like? It feels like, anyone watch Squid Game? Yeah. It feels like you've got a timer, and it's like, get through as many questions as you can, otherwise it's going to time out. So, second question.
Next, we're going to Greece, and Nefeli asked, how will maritime transport play a crucial role in the future of sustainable transport?
Great question. Big question.
Yeah, I don't profess to be an expert on this at all, but we know that it's maritime transport is responsible for a huge number of carbon emissions, so it's got to be something that's part of the discussion and part of the innovation in terms of how do we reduce carbon emissions from that sector.
But it also links back to your earlier point right at the start, where you spoke about local business, local produce. So trying to find new ways of, so again, like when we talk about reducing our carbon emissions, and, when we talk about waste, for example, right? Part of the shift towards a more just and green world and cleaner world is about developing a circular economy, which is about the idea of reusing, having products and services that we can reuse. So I think it's really important that, even in the context of moving goods around the world, obviously maritime being a really important one, we need to think about how we strongly develop a circular economy where people reduce think about the way you dress, the way you eat. So there's something about reduction of consuming, and then there's something about reusing as well. So I think that's in the sort of context of that. Should we move to the next? Is there any other questions in the room? I might take one more. So if you've got one there, and then we'll take 2 questions from you online. We'll do them in freeze.
All right, my name is Tilman. Many thanks for today's event. I'm having a question for the next COP. So I'm also a fan of leading by example. So how can we get in a most sustainable way to the next COP to Egypt? And what can we do to do this, to lead by example and not being blamed for having double standards to fly to the next COP? Or is there, put in different words, should there be a fixed location, which is, if we have to fly, is there a location in the world we have to choose, which is the most sustainable to reach if we bring in 25,000 people? Thank you.
That's a very good question, and I don't know if anyone saw the papers yesterday. Not to get too political, but a certain politician took a flight from Brighton to Glasgow, who claims to be a very environmental leader, but anyway, I won't go into that any further. 2 more online questions, and we wrap up from there.
Hello? Oh, sorry. So next up, we have Zoe from Edinburgh. How can both travel less globally and how can we maintain a sense of the global world and community? Or are we on the road to isolation?
That's a very good question. Right, so what I'm going to do is, Shanona, if I can get you to answer the second question, and then Sophie, you answer the first one. So Shanona, just to come to you, on that point, it's so important because, particularly for a lot of young people, we live in this international world where through social media we connect and meet lots of different people. We have friends from all over around the world. How do you sort of keep that social element whilst at the same time recognizes that we probably need to reduce the amount of times that we travel?
So yeah, like you said, online definitely helps. My group we've been formed for almost 2 years now. This is the first time we met in person. We've been doing everything virtually. So it's possible, through social media, through online events, through working from home, it does help. But I agree that you do lose a bit of your sense of global, relationship, global community. Ideally, I think it would be, in the long term, it would become where traveling abroad, obviously not as frequently, but wouldn't have as big of an impact because we've, sorted out other areas. So, of course, within, traveling within your country, that should be done public transport, and I'm leading back to the same point now, but that would mean making it more accessible, making trains more affordable, making them greener. So I think in that sense, that would be a solution. But I think it's difficult with the global community, but I do think it's possible without traveling so much. I think that's an education issue as well, sending the message out to everybody, providing different solutions. Online accessibility, it's not for everyone, for people who don't have, the equipment, the resources. It can be really difficult and it can be very isolating, like you said. So I think that would be, making sure that people have the education and the feeling like they're being included on it is important as well.
Very good. Sophie, to come to you on the first question. So going to the next COP, how do we lead by example? And obviously a lot of people need to get there. So how do we do that in a sustainable way?
Well, I think we're sort of doing part of that now. We've got more audience members online than we have in the room. So I think the kind of hybrid model has now become completely normal. Completely take point around, that's not appropriate for everyone. But why have we never made it an option before? Really, it's a completely obvious thing to do. So I think that's the first thing. I think in terms of sort of, innovation plays a part in that, in all of this, and perhaps, the fact that we are all now online, that is an innovation. There will be undoubtedly innovation in aviation. You're never going to get away from, a complete, cease it in flying. I think the thing that we need to start with is the mega travelers, who are the ones, and they are the top, they tend to be the richest people in the world who cause the biggest amount of emissions from flights and so on. And we've got to be really careful there to apply that sort of thinking and test around social justice. Our mission here, I don't think, is to stop your average family who might have saved really hard from going and experiencing a different country for their holiday once a year. Our mission is to stop people who, throughout their business, may be flying from the UK to a board meeting in New York once a month, and all over the rest of the world where that could be done online. So I think that's really important. And then finally, very quickly, I just think there's some policies that people could put in place. Something that I've seen recently, what I'm going to look at for my own organisation, giving extra days leave to staff who are travelling if they take sustainable transport methods. Now, if you're going to go to holiday in Spain, you can get there in a much more sustainable way than flying. It will take you longer, so employers have a part to play there. I'm looking at potentially giving my staff, if you travel sustainably, I'll give you back in your annual leave the amount of time that it's extra time that's taken you.
Yeah. The lesson from today is if you are going to enter Squid Game, don't go with Sophie. We've run out of time.
Don't kill me.
No, I'm joking. We've got exactly 1 minute left. So thank you all so much for this discussion. Can we get a massive round of applause for our speakers, please? That was a very long clap. Thank you. Also want to say a massive thank you to the One Young World team and the team here at the Extreme Hangout venue as well. I think it's so important that we have these spaces for young people to be leading these conversations. I think too often when we talk about transport and other things, you know, it's sort of seen as very technical topics which are sort of only for a certain group of people to talk about. So I think it's really important that we have these spaces where young people can have that voice. But thank you for being such a great audience, and hope you enjoy the rest of your day.
Thank you so much, Sophie, Shanona, Mette. Honestly, such an engaging conversation. Thank you so much as well to everybody who dropped in the questions and to our audience here and digitally. So thank you so much again, and tune in for the next session at 12. Thank you.